On the evening of July 13th, 1837, a coach moved through the streets of London carrying a young woman who had not yet learned how to be queen. Victoria was 18 years old. The sky above the city had softened into the amber haze that settles over summer evenings in England, when heat lingers in the stone and the Thames exhales a faint mist that curls upward through the streets of Westminster. The horse's hooves struck the cobblestones in a rhythm she would come to associate with obligation, and the coach passed through gates that had been opened for her by men whose names she did not know. Buckingham Palace stood before her. It was not yet finished. Scaffolding clung to sections of the eastern facade. The smell of wet plaster drifted from rooms where workmen had been laboring only hours before. Gas lamps flickered in sconces that had been installed too quickly, and somewhere in the depths of the building, a door that had never been properly fitted creaked against its frame with every gust of wind that passed through the courtyard. She stepped out of the coach and looked upward. The building was immense. Pale Portland stone rose in ranks of columns and pilasters, attempting the kind of classical dignity that had defined European palaces for centuries. And yet something felt incomplete, almost improvised. The east wing had been added hastily, the proportions not quite matching the original design. The interior, she would soon discover, was a maze of corridors that led to rooms she could not imagine needing. State apartments designed for ceremonies that had not yet been invented, bedrooms that would remain empty for decades, kitchens so far from the dining rooms that food arrived cold even in summer. This was to be her home. This was to be the center of British royal life, the visible heart of an empire that would soon span continents. And on that first night, as Victoria walked through halls that echoed with the sound of her own footsteps, she understood something that would take the public another century to recognize. The grandeur was a performance. Behind the facade, nothing was quite ready. The machinery of monarchy was being constructed in real time, and she was expected to inhabit a building that had been designed not for living, but for the projection of an idea. The history of Buckingham Palace is not a story of luxury inherited and maintained. It is a story of perpetual construction, of a building that has never truly been finished, of systems installed and replaced and reinstalled, of crises absorbed and survived, of compromises made in the dark. The palace that visitors photograph from behind iron railings is the result of 2 centuries of improvisation, each generation grappling with the same fundamental question. What does it cost to remain symbolic? The land beneath Buckingham Palace was, for most of human history, marshy and unremarkable. The area that would eventually become the western edge of London's ceremonial core was once little more than soggy ground near the banks of the Tyburn, a river that no longer exists on maps but still flows beneath the city, diverted into sewers and storm drains, its presence remembered only by the occasional flooding of basement corridors during heavy rains. Before any palace rose here, before any duke or king claimed the site, the ground was pasture. Cattle grazed, laborers cut reeds. The mud was thick in winter and baked hard in summer, and no one imagined that this particular patch of earth would become one of the most photographed locations on the planet. The first significant structure on the site was built in 1603, a manor house owned by a man named William Blake, not the poet, but a merchant who had acquired the land and constructed a home suited to his station. That house passed through several hands before arriving, in 1703, in the possession of John Sheffield, the Duke of Buckingham. Sheffield was ambitious and vain in equal measure, a courtier who had survived the political chaos of the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution, and who believed, not unreasonably, that his decades of service entitled him to a residence that reflected his importance. He demolished the existing structure and commissioned a new house, Buckingham House as it came to be called. The building was substantial, but not extravagant by the standards of the aristocracy. It was designed to impress visitors approaching from the east, with a central block flanked by wings, a courtyard open to the gardens, and interiors decorated in the Baroque style, then fashionable among the English elite. Sheffield lived there until his death in 1721, and the house passed to his illegitimate son, who in turn sold it in 1761 to King George III. George purchased Buckingham House as a private residence for his wife, Queen Charlotte. It was not intended to serve as a royal palace. St. James's Palace, with its medieval origins and Tudor modifications, remained the official seat of the monarchy. Buckingham House was meant to be something more intimate, a retreat from court life, a place where the royal family could exist, at least in theory, as something resembling an ordinary household. Charlotte bore 15 children in that house. She hosted small gatherings, read novels by candlelight, and cultivated a garden where she grew exotic plants sent from the colonies. The building was expanded over the decades to accommodate the growing family, but it retained the character of a grand private home rather than a ceremonial palace. This would change. Everything would change. The forces that would transform Buckingham House into Buckingham Palace were already gathering in the figure of George III's eldest son, a man whose appetites would leave a permanent mark on the architecture of England. George Augustus Frederick, the Prince of Wales who would eventually become George IV, was born in 1762 into a family that prized restraint. His father, George III, was famously frugal, suspicious of excess, and committed to a vision of monarchy that emphasized duty over display. The son was, from the beginning, a creature of entirely different instincts. He was intelligent, cultured, and genuinely knowledgeable about art and architecture. He was also extravagant, self-indulgent, and possessed of an almost pathological need to transform every space he inhabited into a theatrical statement of his own magnificence. By the time George became Prince Regent in 1811, his father, having descended into the mental illness that would incapacitate him for the final decade of his reign, he had already demonstrated his capacity for architectural ambition. The royal pavilion at Brighton, with its onion domes and chinoiserie interiors, was a palace of fantasy built on borrowed money. Carlton House, his London residence, had been renovated and expanded multiple times at staggering expense. He understood buildings as expressions of power, and he understood that power in the 19th century required spectacle. When George finally became king in 1820, he was 57 years old, corpulent, gout-ridden, and deeply unpopular with the public. His estranged wife, Caroline of Brunswick, had attempted to claim her place at his coronation and been physically barred from Westminster Abbey. The press mocked him. His subjects tolerated him. And yet he possessed, in his final decade, the authority to reshape the capital. He turned his attention to Buckingham House. St. James's Palace, he believed, was inadequate, too small, too old, too associated with earlier centuries. London needed a royal residence that could rival the great palaces of Europe, a statement of British power visible to ambassadors and citizens alike. He did not intend to live modestly. He intended to build a palace. The architect he chose was John Nash, a man whose career had been defined by boldness and whose reputation would eventually be destroyed by the same project that should have crowned his legacy. Nash was in his 70s when he received the commission. He had already transformed large portions of London with his designs for Regent Street and Regent's Park, creating the theatrical urban vistas that still define the city's West End. He was skilled at creating illusions of grandeur, at using stucco and clever proportions to make buildings appear more imposing than their budgets should have allowed. George gave Nash what every architect dreams of: a royal client with unlimited ambitions and access to parliamentary funds. Parliament had allocated £150,000 for the renovation of Buckingham House. a substantial sum, though far less than what the project would eventually consume. Nash set to work in 1825, and almost immediately, the original plan was abandoned in favor of something far more ambitious. What Nash proposed was not a renovation, but a transformation. He would retain the shell of the old house but encase it in new construction, expanding the building on 3 sides, adding new state apartments, creating a triumphal arch at the entrance, and decorating the whole in a French neoclassical style intended to evoke the grandeur of Versailles. The building would be U-shaped, open to the east, with the monarch's private apartments facing west toward the gardens. Every surface would be adorned with carved stone, gilded moldings, and paintings commissioned from the finest artists of the age. The scale was deliberately overwhelming. Nash understood that architecture, at its most political, is about the manipulation of human perception. A visitor approaching Buckingham Palace was meant to feel small. The proportions were designed to dwarf the individual, to create a sense of awe that would translate, unconsciously, into deference toward the institution housed within. Columns rose to heights that exceeded any functional necessity. Ceilings stretched upward into shadows that gas lamps could barely illuminate. Corridors extended for lengths that made walking from one room to another a form of mild exertion. But the grandeur was not simply about intimidation, it was also about performance. The state apartments were designed as stages, rooms in which the rituals of monarchy could be enacted for audiences of ambassadors, aristocrats, and visiting dignitaries. The throne room, with its crimson silk walls and elaborate plasterwork ceiling, was meant to be photographed, or rather, since photography did not yet exist, to be remembered and described in letters sent across Europe. The picture gallery, stretching 155 feet along the central axis of the building, displayed works by Rubens, Rembrandt, and Van Dyck, announcing that Britain's monarchs were patrons of culture on par with the Medicis or the Habsburgs. The green drawing room, the blue drawing room, the white drawing room, each was decorated in its signature color, creating a sequence of visual experiences intended to culminate in the climactic moment of audience with the sovereign. The construction of Buckingham Palace consumed workers by the thousands. Masons, carpenters, plasterers, gilders, painters, ironworkers, glaziers, and laborers of every description descended on the site beginning in 1825 and did not leave for more than a decade. The building site became one of the largest employers in London, a small city within the city, governed by its own rhythms and hierarchies. The primary material was Portland stone, quarried on the Isle of Portland off the coast of Dorset. This limestone had been favored by English architects since Christopher Wren used it to rebuild St. Denis. Paul's Cathedral, after the Great Fire, and its pale color gave London's most important buildings their characteristic appearance. Extracting the stone was brutal work. Quarrymen cut blocks from the cliffs using hand tools, picks, wedges, and saws powered by human muscle rather than machine. The blocks, some weighing several tons, were lowered to barges and transported by sea to the Thames, then up the river to wharves near the construction site, where they were unloaded by cranes operated by teams of men pulling on ropes. Every block had to be cut to precise dimensions, then carved with the decorative elements that Nash's design required. The facade alone featured hundreds of individual pieces of carved stone, capitals for the columns, keystones for the arches, balustrades for the roof lines, and medallions depicting royal emblems and classical motifs. The carvers worked in sheds near the site, their chisels striking stone for hours at a stretch, their lungs filling gradually with the fine dust that would eventually kill many of them. Silicosis was a known hazard of the trade, though it was not called by that name. Men coughed, grew weak, and died in their 40s. Their names are not recorded in any official history of the palace. The interior work was equally labor-intensive, but required different skills. Plasterers created the elaborate ceilings that remain among the building's most celebrated features, dense compositions of molded ornament featuring acanthus leaves, rosettes, egg and dart borders, and figures drawn from classical mythology. Each element was formed in a mold, allowed to harden, and then fixed in place on the ceiling using a combination of adhesive and metal armatures. The work was done from scaffolding, the craftsmen working with their arms raised above their heads for hours at a time. Muscles ached, necks cramped. The finished ceilings were painted in combinations of white and gold, the gilding applied in thin sheets of gold leaf that had to be handled with extreme delicacy to avoid tearing. The woodwork throughout the palace was executed in a variety of timbers imported from across the globe: mahogany from the Caribbean, oak from English forests, pine from Scandinavia, walnut from France. Each wood had its own character and required its own techniques. Cabinet makers constructed doors that weighed hundreds of pounds, their panels fitted with tolerances so precise that they would still close smoothly a century later. Inlay work decorated the floors of the state apartments, creating patterns of contrasting woods that formed geometric designs visible from across the rooms. And beneath all this visible craftsmanship, invisible systems were being installed that would make the building habitable. Buckingham Palace was one of the first large structures in London to incorporate modern heating and ventilation. The original system used a network of ducts connected to furnaces in the basement, which heated air that was then circulated through the building via grates set into the floors. The furnaces burned coal, tons of it, delivered by cart to the palace's rear entrances and shoveled into the boilers by men who worked in conditions of perpetual heat and darkness. Later, steam heating would be introduced, requiring an even more elaborate infrastructure of pipes, valves, and radiators. The palace became, in effect, an early prototype of the mechanical buildings that would dominate the 20th century, though its systems were more primitive and more labor-dependent than those that came later. Water supply was another challenge. London's municipal water system was unreliable at best, and the palace required quantities far beyond what the public mains could provide. Wells were dug on the grounds, cisterns were constructed in the basement to store water for firefighting. Pumps, initially hand-operated and later steam-powered, moved water to tanks in the attic, from which it descended by gravity to taps and toilets throughout the building. The plumbing alone required miles of lead pipe, each joint sealed by hand, each fixture tested and retested to prevent leaks that could damage the decorations above. The lighting system evolved over the course of construction. Gas lighting had been introduced to London streets in the early 19th century, and Nash incorporated gas into the palace from the beginning. Pipes ran through the walls to sconces and chandeliers, where controlled flames provided illumination far brighter than candles could achieve. But gas was dangerous. Leaks could cause explosions. Flames could ignite draperies. The system required constant monitoring by staff trained to detect the smell of escaping gas and to operate the valves that controlled supply throughout the building. All of this, the stone, the plaster, the wood, the metal, the water, the gas, had to be coordinated and assembled according to a schedule that was constantly being disrupted by changes in design. George IV could not resist modifications. He would visit the site, observe the progress, and announce that certain rooms must be enlarged, certain decorations must be more elaborate, certain materials must be replaced with more expensive alternatives. Nash, eager to please his patron, accommodated these demands, and the budget spiraled upward. By 1828, costs had exceeded £400,000. By 1830, when George died, the total had reached nearly $500,000, and the building was still not complete. George IV's death in June of 1830 created a crisis that had been decades in the making. The new king, William IV, had none of his brother's taste for spectacle. He found Buckingham Palace ostentatious and expressed no desire to live there. More importantly, Parliament had grown deeply suspicious of the project's costs. The original budget of £150,000 had been exceeded by a factor of 3, and the building was still not ready for occupancy. Investigations were launched, committees were formed. Nash was called to testify. The architect's defense was that he had simply executed his client's wishes. George had demanded grandeur, and grandeur had been provided. But this argument, however technically accurate, failed to protect Nash from the political consequences. He was dismissed from the project in 1830, his reputation destroyed, his life's work ending in disgrace. He would die in 1835 without ever seeing the palace completed. His replacement was Edward Blore, an architect of more modest talents but greater administrative competence. Blore had no illusions about his role. He was not there to create a masterpiece. He was there to finish a troubled project at minimum additional cost. He simplified Nash's designs, eliminated some of the more expensive decorative elements, and focused on making the building functional rather than magnificent. The work continued through the early 1830s, though William IV's lack of interest meant that there was little urgency. It was only when Victoria ascended to the throne in 1837 that the palace gained a resident who would actually live there. And Victoria, for all her youth and inexperience, immediately understood both the building's potential and its problems. The potential was obvious. Buckingham Palace was, despite its troubled history, the most impressive royal residence in London. Its state apartments were larger and more modern than anything at St. James's. Its location at the western end of the mall gave it a prominence that earlier palaces lacked. Its gardens provided privacy and greenery in the heart of an increasingly industrial city. For a young queen attempting to establish her authority, the palace offered a stage on which the drama of monarchy could be performed. The problems were equally obvious. The building was not finished. The east wing did not yet exist. The quadrangle remained open to the park. The heating system was inadequate for British winters. The kitchens were located so far from the dining rooms that servants had to carry food across hundreds of feet of corridor. The ventilation was poor, causing rooms to become stuffy during ceremonies and leaving lingering smells of gas and cooking throughout the residential areas. The staff quarters were cramped and uncomfortable. The plumbing was temperamental. The palace, in short, was a magnificent shell with an interior that barely functioned. Victoria's response to these problems would define the building's next phase of development. She was practical by nature, more interested in comfort than in display, and she approached the palace as a manager rather than as a collector of beautiful objects. She worked with her husband, Prince Albert, to address the most pressing issues. They commissioned improvements to the heating and ventilation. They reorganized the household staff to improve efficiency. They added bathrooms and modernized the kitchens, and they authorized the construction of the east wing that would complete the quadrangle and provide additional space for visiting dignitaries and family members. The east wing, designed by Edward Blore and completed in 1850, enclosed the palace on all 4 sides and created the facade that faces the mall today. It also concealed Nash's original entrance, the Marble Arch, which was deemed too small for the grand ceremonial arrivals that Victoria envisioned. The arch was disassembled and moved to its current location at the northeast corner of Hyde Park, where it stands today as a monument to the palace's perpetual state of revision. The question of money hung over Buckingham Palace from its earliest days and has never entirely been resolved. The building's construction had been funded by Parliament, which meant that every expense was subject to public scrutiny. The Victorian era brought increasing demands for accountability in royal finances, and Victoria herself was sensitive to criticism of royal extravagance. She understood that the palace's grandeur was a double-edged sword, impressive enough to enhance the monarchy's prestige, but expensive enough to fuel accusations of waste. The costs of operating the palace were staggering by any measure. In the mid-19th century, the household employed several hundred staff in roles ranging from the exalted to the menial. At the top were the great officers of state, the Lord Chamberlain, the Master of the Horse, the Lord Steward, who held positions that carried ceremonial duties and social prestige. Below them were the working officers who actually managed the household, the comptroller, the paymaster, the housekeeper, the chef. And below them, in vast numbers, were the servants who did the physical labor of maintaining the building: footmen, maids, cooks, laundresses, stable hands, lamplighters, firemen, and countless others whose names appear only in payroll records. Feeding this staff and the royal family required an elaborate supply chain. Meat came from contracted butchers, vegetables came from the palace gardens and from markets across London. Wine and spirits came from merchants who had held royal warrants for generations. Coal came in quantities sufficient to heat a small village, hundreds of tons per year, delivered to the palace's storage areas and consumed by the furnaces that ran day and night through the winter months. The laundry alone employed dozens of workers processing thousands of items weekly: sheets, towels, tablecloths, napkins, and the elaborate uniforms worn by the household staff. All of this cost money, and the sources of that money were complicated and often contested. The civil list, established in the 18th century, provided Parliament's contribution to the monarch's expenses. But the civil list was fixed by agreement at the beginning of each reign, and it did not automatically increase to match rising costs. Inflation, expanding household needs, and the growing demands of public ceremony all put pressure on resources that were insufficient from the start. Victoria attempted to manage these pressures through a combination of personal frugality and institutional reform. She was notoriously careful with her own spending, reusing clothing, avoiding unnecessary purchases, and scrutinizing household accounts for waste. She and Albert reorganized the household administration to eliminate sinecures and improve efficiency. They reduced the number of servants in some departments while expanding others that actually contributed to the palace's functioning. The result was a household that operated more smoothly than it had under her predecessors, though never comfortably within its budget. The true financial picture was further complicated by the question of who owned what. Buckingham Palace itself was crown property, maintained with public funds. But the artwork, furniture, and decorations within the palace represented a mixture of public and private collections. Some items had been purchased by monarchs with their personal funds and remained part of the private royal collection. Others had been acquired using parliamentary appropriations and were technically public property. The distinction was important because it determined what could be sold in times of financial difficulty and what had to be preserved regardless of cost. This ambiguity would persist for generations, creating ongoing confusion about the relationship between the monarch's private wealth and the public's investment in royal ceremony. The palace, in this sense, embodied the fundamental tension at the heart of constitutional monarchy. The sovereign was simultaneously a private individual with personal property and a public institution funded by the taxpayer. The building where this individual lived was both a home and a symbol, and its maintenance required navigating the boundary between these roles with constant delicacy. The physical maintenance of the palace was a task that never ended and never could end. Buildings of this scale do not simply stand. They require perpetual intervention to resist the forces that would otherwise return them to rubble. Stone weathers, metal rusts, wood rots, plaster cracks, paint fades, and in London, the combination of soot, rain, and acidic atmosphere attacked every surface with particular ferocity. The 19th century was the age of coal, and London was its capital. Factories, homes, and public buildings all burned coal for heating and power, releasing vast quantities of sulfur dioxide into the air. This gas combined with moisture to form sulfuric acid, which fell as rain and ate away at limestone facades. The Portland stone of Buckingham Palace, so pristine when first installed, gradually turned black with accumulated soot and began to decay from the surface inward. Carved details that had taken weeks to execute lost their sharpness within decades. Balusters and finials crumbled. The building's appearance changed from the creamy white intended by its architects to a grimy gray that matched the polluted sky. Inside, the challenges were different but equally relentless. The heating system deposited fine layers of coal dust on every surface, requiring constant cleaning. Gas lighting left soot on ceilings and walls. Candles, still used in some areas, dripped wax on floors and furnishings. The thousands of visitors who passed through the state apartments during ceremonies and receptions wore down carpets, smudged walls, and stressed furniture. Every fabric in the building, the silk wall coverings, the velvet draperies, the upholstery on hundreds of chairs, faded in sunlight and aged in the chemical atmosphere of Victorian London. The staff responsible for maintenance occupied a hidden world within the palace. They worked in basements and service corridors that paralleled the grand rooms above, emerging to clean and repair when the royal family was elsewhere. Their labor was deliberately invisible. The goal was to create an impression of effortless magnificence, as if the palace maintained itself through some natural process rather than through human effort. But the effort was immense. Teams of housemaids worked through the night after state functions, restoring rooms to pristine condition before the next day's activities. Craftsmen from the Office of Works made regular rounds, repairing damage as it occurred. Specialists were called in for particularly delicate work, re-gilding picture frames, conserving paintings, restoring the inlay on damaged floors. The palace also required protection from threats more dramatic than ordinary wear. Fire was a constant danger in an era when buildings were heated by open flames and lit by gas. The palace employed a permanent firefighting staff equipped with hand pumps and hoses connected to the water tanks in the basement. Buckets of sand stood in corridors for use against small fires. Night watchmen made regular rounds, checking for sparks and smoldering hazards. Despite these precautions, fires did occur, small ones, usually contained before they could spread, but terrifying in their implications for a building filled with irreplaceable artworks and historical documents. Security was another concern that grew more pressing as the century progressed. The palace was not simply a residence, it was a symbol of state, and symbols attract those who wish to make political statements. Victoria survived multiple assassination attempts during her reign, and the palace's exposed location, surrounded by public parks and accessible streets, made it vulnerable in ways that older royal residences, hidden behind medieval walls, had not been. Guards were posted at entrances, police patrolled the perimeter. But the balance between security and accessibility was difficult to maintain, and the palace remained, in certain respects, surprisingly permeable. The most notorious breach occurred in 1840, when a 17-year-old named Edward Jones was discovered hiding in the palace and claimed to have been living there undetected for nearly a year. He had apparently entered through open windows, slept on sofas, eaten food from the kitchens, and even sat on the throne. The scandal prompted immediate improvements to security, but the incident revealed how difficult it was to monitor a building of the palace's size. Its very immensity was a vulnerability. There were simply too many rooms, too many corridors, too many points of entry for any guard force to cover completely. The death of Prince Albert in 1861 transformed both Victoria and the palace she inhabited. Albert had been more than a husband. He had been Victoria's intellectual partner, her advisor on matters of state, and her collaborator in the management of the household. His death plunged her into a grief that would define the remainder of her reign. She withdrew from public life for years, appearing only rarely at ceremonies, preferring the seclusion of Windsor Castle and Balmoral to the exposed grandeur of London. Buckingham Palace stood largely empty, its state apartments unused, its ceremonial functions suspended. This withdrawal had consequences for the palace itself. Buildings that are not occupied deteriorate more quickly than those in regular use. The absence of heating in certain wings allowed damp to penetrate. The lack of ventilation caused mold to form in storage areas. The regular cleaning that had kept the building in order was reduced to minimum levels. Staff numbers declined. The palace entered a period of slow decay that mirrored its owner's emotional state. Public criticism grew. Newspapers questioned why the monarch maintained an expensive London residence that she refused to inhabit. Radicals suggested that the palace be repurposed for some public use. The civil list came under renewed scrutiny, with members of Parliament arguing that funds should not be spent maintaining buildings for a queen who had effectively retired from public life. Victoria's response was defensive and stubborn. The palace was hers by right, and she would use it, or not use it, as she saw fit. The crisis eventually passed. Victoria gradually resumed public appearances in the 1870s, and the palace was refurbished for renewed ceremonial use. But the episode had exposed a vulnerability in the institution's foundations. The palace's value depended on its use. A symbol that no one sees is no symbol at all. The monarchy's survival required visibility, and visibility required the palace to function as intended. Victoria's withdrawal had demonstrated that the relationship between sovereign and residents was more complicated than either side acknowledged. The palace needed the monarch to give it meaning, but the monarch also needed the palace to maintain the public presence on which modern constitutional monarchy depended. The reign of Edward VII, beginning in 1901, brought a new era of social activity to Buckingham Palace. Edward had waited decades for the throne, entertaining himself during his mother's long reign with the pleasures available to a wealthy aristocrat: horse racing, yachting, travel, and a social life of legendary extravagance. He transformed the palace into a venue for the kind of entertaining he had perfected at Sandringham and Marlborough House, hosting elaborate dinners, balls, and receptions that restored the building to its intended purpose. But Edward also recognized that the palace required significant updating to meet early 20th century standards. Victoria's approach had been conservative. She had accepted the building as she found it and made only essential repairs. Edward commissioned more ambitious work. The electrical system, which had been partially installed in the 1880s, was expanded to reach all areas of the palace. Gas lighting was gradually replaced with electric fixtures, eliminating the soot and fire hazards of the earlier system. The heating was modernized. New bathrooms were added to the private apartments. The kitchens were reorganized and equipped with modern appliances. The most visible change came in 1913, when the eastern facade, the face the palace presents to the world, was completely rebuilt. The original facade, designed by Edward Bloor, had been constructed of soft Caen stone that had weathered badly in London's polluted atmosphere. The new facade, designed by Aston Webb, was clad in harder Portland stone and featured the familiar neoclassical composition that visitors recognize today. A central balcony above the main entrance, flanked by symmetrical wings adorned with columns and pediments. The work was completed in just 13 weeks, a remarkable feat of organization that required round-the-clock labor and precise coordination between contractors. The scaffolding came down in time for the celebration of King George V's coronation, presenting a freshly pristine building that seemed to embody the confidence of Imperial Britain. That confidence would soon be tested. The First World War brought restrictions on royal entertaining and redirected resources toward the war effort. The palace served as a backdrop for patriotic ceremonies rather than social gatherings. George and Queen Mary made public appearances from the famous balcony, associating the monarchy with national unity in a time of crisis. The building's symbolic function shifted. It became less a venue for elite socialization and more a stage for popular communion, a place where the sovereign could appear before masses of citizens gathered in the street below. The interwar years brought new financial pressures and new questions about the role of the monarchy in a changing society. The Russian Revolution had eliminated one of Europe's oldest royal families. The German, Austrian, and Ottoman empires had collapsed. Across the continent, republics were replacing monarchies, and the British crown was forced to articulate why it should continue to exist. Part of the answer lay in tradition and ceremony, in the visible continuation of practices that connected the present to the past. Buckingham Palace was central to this strategy. The great state occasions, coronations, weddings, jubilees, were performed with increasing elaboration, the rituals amplified by new technologies of mass communication. Radio broadcasts allowed listeners across the empire to hear events as they happened. Newsreels brought images of royal pageantry to cinema audiences worldwide. The palace became a stage not just for those present, but for millions who would never visit London. But tradition alone was not sufficient. The monarchy also needed to demonstrate relevance, to show that it served some purpose beyond the perpetuation of its own existence. George V and Queen Mary cultivated an image of domestic stability that contrasted with the political chaos of the era. They visited hospitals, factories, and slums. They associated themselves with charitable causes. They presented themselves as symbols of national continuity in a time of rapid change. The palace became the backdrop for this performance of public service, its grandeur lending authority to the crown's claims of national importance. The abdication crisis of 1936 threatened to unravel these carefully constructed meanings. Edward VIII's decision to renounce the throne for the woman he loved threw the institution into turmoil and exposed divisions within the royal family. Buckingham Palace was the setting for some of the most tense moments of the crisis, as family members gathered to discuss options, and the new king, George VI, prepared to assume responsibilities he had never expected to bear. George VI's reign would be defined by the Second World War, and the war would transform the relationship between the palace and the public in ways that previous crises had not. The building was bombed 9 times during the Blitz, the most serious strike landing in the quadrangle in September of 1940 and destroying the chapel. The king and queen chose to remain in London during the attacks, a decision that carried genuine personal risk and earned genuine public admiration. When Buckingham Palace was damaged, the Queen reportedly remarked that she could now look the East End in the face, a reference to the working-class neighborhoods that had suffered devastating bombing while wealthier areas remained relatively unscathed. The bomb damage required immediate repair work and longer-term reconstruction. Windows were boarded, debris was cleared, temporary structures replaced those that had been destroyed. The building continued to function as a working palace throughout the war, hosting meetings, receiving dignitaries, and serving as the command center for the monarchy's contribution to national morale. The balcony became the site of iconic appearances, the king and queen with the 2 young princesses waving to crowds on VE Day in 1945 as the nation celebrated victory. The post-war decades brought austerity, reconstruction, and gradual adaptation to a world in which Britain's imperial power had diminished. The palace reflected these changes in its operations, if not in its appearance. Staff numbers, which had declined during the war, were not fully restored. Economies were sought in every department. The elaborately hierarchical household structure of the Victorian era was simplified, with some roles eliminated and others combined. The accession of Elizabeth II in 1952 inaugurated a reign that would span more than 7 decades and would see the palace undergo its most significant transformations since the 19th century. Elizabeth inherited an institution that had successfully adapted to the challenges of the 20th century, but faced new questions about its future. The age of deference was ending. The media was becoming more intrusive. The public expected transparency in ways that previous generations had not. The decision to televise the coronation in 1953 was among the most consequential of the early reign. Against the advice of traditionalists who feared the vulgarization of sacred ceremony, Elizabeth allowed cameras into Westminster Abbey. More than 20 million people in Britain watched the broadcast, and hundreds of millions more saw it worldwide. The monarchy was entering the age of mass media, and its relationship with the public would never be the same. Buckingham Palace was slower to open its doors. The state apartments remained inaccessible to ordinary visitors throughout the 1960s and 70s. The palace's function was to provide a setting for official business, audiences with ambassadors, investitures, garden parties, rather than to serve as a tourist attraction. The building's mystique depended partly on its inaccessibility. To see inside, one had to be invited. This changed in the 1990s, driven by a crisis that forced the institution to reconsider its relationship with the public. In November of 1992, Windsor Castle caught fire. The blaze, which started in the Queen's private chapel and spread through much of the state apartments, caused damage estimated at more than £36 million. The question of who would pay for repairs provoked unexpected public controversy. The government initially suggested that taxpayers should fund the restoration, but this proposal met with resistance from a public already skeptical of royal finances. Why, critics asked, should the public pay to repair a building occupied by one of the world's wealthiest families? The solution was to generate revenue from the royal estate itself. Beginning in 1993, Buckingham Palace opened its state apartments to paying visitors during the summer months when the royal family was elsewhere. The admission fees would help fund the Windsor Castle restoration and would eventually contribute to the palace's own maintenance costs. The decision was controversial within the royal household, where some saw it as a degradation of the palace's dignity. But it was also pragmatic, acknowledging that the institution's survival depended on public support that could not be taken for granted. The opening of Buckingham Palace to visitors required a complete rethinking of how the building operated. The state apartments had never been designed for mass tourism. Their floors, many of them delicate parquet, were not built to withstand thousands of footsteps daily. Their furnishings, many of them centuries old, were not meant to be approached by crowds of curious strangers. The environmental conditions, temperature, humidity, light levels that suited official ceremonies were not necessarily compatible with the protection of fragile artworks and textiles. A new infrastructure was constructed within the existing building. Rope barriers guided visitors along prescribed routes. Protective coverings were placed over vulnerable surfaces. Climate control systems were adjusted to manage the influx of bodies and the changes in temperature they caused. Staff members were stationed throughout the route to answer questions and prevent visitors from straying into restricted areas. The palace became, for a few weeks each summer, a hybrid institution, part royal residence, part museum, part tourist attraction. The economic impact was significant. In a typical summer season, the palace received several 100,000 visitors, each paying an admission fee that contributed to the maintenance fund. The gift shop, located in a former service area, sold souvenirs that ranged from tasteful reproductions to items of frankly commercial character. The Garden Café served refreshments at prices calibrated to the captive audience. Every element of the experience was designed to extract maximum revenue from visitors willing to pay for proximity to royalty. But tourism was only one component of the palace's evolving economic model. The building continued to host official events, state banquets for visiting heads of state, investitures for recipients of honors, garden parties for thousands of invited guests each summer. These events cost money to produce but generated value in less tangible forms: diplomatic goodwill, public engagement, continuity of tradition. The palace functioned as a kind of machine for manufacturing legitimacy, converting the raw materials of history and architecture into the refined product of institutional authority. The 21st century has brought new challenges that test the palace's capacity for adaptation. The costs of maintaining a building of this age and complexity have escalated relentlessly. The infrastructure installed in the 19th and 20th centuries has reached the end of its useful life. Wiring that was cutting edge in the 1950s is now a fire hazard. Plumbing that seemed modern in the 1930s leaks and fails. The heating systems, repeatedly upgraded but never fully replaced, consume energy at rates that are both expensive and environmentally irresponsible. In 2016, a comprehensive assessment concluded that the palace required a complete renovation of its mechanical and electrical systems, a project estimated to cost nearly £400 million and take a decade to complete. The scale of the work was unprecedented. Every room in the building would be affected. Artworks would have to be removed and stored. Staff would have to be relocated. The palace would remain operational throughout the renovation, but the disruption would be constant and extensive. The funding for this work came from the sovereign grant, the mechanism that replaced the civil list in 2012. Under this arrangement, the monarchy receives a percentage of the revenue from the Crown estate, the portfolio of property holdings historically associated with the Crown. The percentage was increased specifically to fund the palace renovation from 15% to 25% of Crown estate revenue. Critics argued that this represented an excessive burden on public finances during a period of austerity. Supporters countered that the alternative, allowing a historic building to deteriorate, would be irresponsible stewardship of national heritage. The renovation work has proceeded in phases, each targeting specific systems and areas of the building. Workers have replaced miles of electrical cable, installed modern heating and cooling equipment, and upgraded the plumbing throughout the palace. The work is done largely out of sight, behind temporary walls and beneath floor coverings, so that the building's appearance remains unchanged, even as its internal systems are transformed. The goal is to create a palace that can function for another 50 years without major intervention, a pause in the endless cycle of repair and replacement that defines the life of any historic building. Today, Buckingham Palace employs approximately 800 people in roles that range from senior officials managing the household to cleaners maintaining the vast public and private areas. The household is organized into departments that echo the structure established in Victoria's time, though the specific responsibilities have evolved. The Royal Collection Trust manages the artworks and opens the building to visitors. The master of the household oversees domestic operations. The Lord Chamberlain coordinates ceremonial functions. Each department has its own budget, its own staff, and its own traditions, creating a complex bureaucracy that somehow continues to function despite organizational charts that would baffle any corporate consultant. The daily operations require logistical planning that would be impressive in any context. When a state banquet is held, typically for 170 guests, the preparation begins weeks in advance. The table is laid with precise measurements, 18 inches between place settings, exactly the length of a ceremonial ruler. The china, glassware, and silver are brought from storage and polished by hand. The menu is planned by the royal chef in consultation with diplomatic staff who know each guest's dietary restrictions. The flowers are arranged by royal florists in compositions that reflect the visiting dignitary's national symbols. Nothing is left to chance, nothing is improvised. The food itself is prepared in kitchens located far from the dining room, maintaining the inconvenient geography that Victoria complained about nearly 2 centuries ago. Dishes travel through service corridors, upstairs, and along passages that stretch for hundreds of feet. The staff has developed techniques for keeping food at proper temperature despite these distances: heated trolleys, precise timing, plates warmed to exact specifications. The result, for guests, is an experience of effortless elegance. The labor that produces this effect remains hidden. The gardens that surround the palace are themselves a significant operation. Covering 39 acres in the heart of London, they represent an extraordinary concentration of green space in one of the world's most expensive real estate markets. The gardens include formal lawns, herbaceous borders, a lake, and more than 350 different species of wildflowers. A staff of gardeners maintains the grounds year-round, mowing, planting, pruning, and preparing for the garden parties that are among the palace's most visible public events. More than 30,000 people attend these parties each year, walking on lawns that must recover quickly from the stress. The question of what Buckingham Palace means, what it represents, what it costs, what it provides in return, has no simple answer. The building exists in multiple registers simultaneously. It is a residence, though one in which private life is nearly impossible. It is a workplace, though one whose products are intangible. It is a symbol, though one whose meaning shifts with the viewer's perspective. It is a heritage site, a tourist attraction, a diplomatic venue, and a stage for national ceremony. It is all of these things at once, and none of them quite captures its essential nature. The critics of the palace emphasize its costs and question its value. In a nation with strained public services and persistent inequality, the expenditure of hundreds of millions of pounds on maintaining a building for a single family seems to some observers indefensible. The counter-argument that the monarchy generates economic activity through tourism and contributes to national identity in ways that justify the expense is difficult to verify and easy to dispute. The palace becomes, in this debate, a proxy for larger arguments about tradition, privilege, and the allocation of public resources. The defenders of the palace emphasize its historical significance and its ongoing utility. The building is, they argue, irreplaceable, a physical embodiment of centuries of national history that cannot be valued in purely economic terms. Its ceremonies create moments of national unity that transcend partisan divisions. Its diplomatic functions serve interests that would otherwise require different institutional arrangements. The palace is not simply a cost, it is an investment in continuity, a physical declaration that the nation has a past and intends to have a future. Between these positions lies the more complicated truth that the palace exists because people continue to make choices that sustain it. Every generation faces the question of whether to maintain or abandon the inherited structures of the past. Every budget cycle requires decisions about allocation of scarce resources. Every renovation project forces confrontation with the gap between aspiration and available funds. The palace survives not because its survival is inevitable, but because, year after year, decade after decade, sufficient numbers of people decide that its continuation is worth the effort. The morning routine at Buckingham Palace begins before dawn. Security staff complete their overnight patrols and brief the incoming shift. Kitchen staff begin preparing breakfast for the household and whatever guests may be in residence. Housekeeping staff move through the building, checking rooms, straightening arrangements, ensuring that every surface meets the exacting standards that tradition demands. The offices come to life as correspondence is sorted and the day's schedule is reviewed. The flag is raised, the royal standard. If the sovereign is in residence, the Union Jack; if not, signaling to the world that another day of the monarchy's long existence has begun. In the state apartments, natural light begins to filter through windows that look out over the gardens, and beyond them, over the rooftops of a city that has grown immeasurably since the first Duke built his house on this marshy ground. The paintings on the walls, the Rembrandts, the Van Dycks, the Canalettos, glow faintly in the early morning light, their subjects frozen in poses held for centuries. The chandeliers hang silent, their crystals motionless, waiting for the evening when they will blaze with light for some ceremony or reception. The throne room stands empty, its crimson walls enclosing a space that has witnessed coronations and weddings and the reception of figures from every corner of the globe. Outside, tourists are already gathering at the gates, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, a guard changing, a car arriving, any sign of the life within. They photograph the facade, the railings, the memorial to Queen Victoria that stands in the traffic circle before the main entrance. They do not see the basements where engineers monitor the mechanical systems. They do not see the storage rooms where thousands of objects await their moment in some future exhibition. They do not see the service corridors where staff move quickly between tasks. They see only the facade, the symbol, the idea of monarchy made visible in stone and gilt. This is what the palace was designed to provide. This is what it has provided, at enormous cost and through endless adaptation for nearly 2 centuries. The visible magnificence serves purposes that extend beyond mere display. It creates the conditions under which the invisible work of maintenance can continue. The tourists who pay admission fees fund the renovation projects that keep the building standing. The diplomats who attend state banquets carry away impressions that shape international relationships. The citizens who watch televised ceremonies from the balcony participate in rituals of national identity that no other institution can provide. The greatest paradox of Buckingham Palace is that its survival depends on its willingness to change. The building that stands today is not the building that John Nash designed, nor the building that Victoria inhabited, nor the building that survived the Blitz. It is a palimpsest, layer upon layer of modification and adaptation, each generation adding its contributions while removing or concealing those of its predecessors. The palace endures not because it has remained the same, but because it has been willing to become something different. This adaptability is not unique to Buckingham Palace. It is the condition of all institutions that survive across centuries. The monarchy itself has followed the same pattern, transforming from an absolute power to a constitutional figurehead, from a ruling family to a public institution, from a private household to a heritage brand. The palace mirrors and enables these transformations, providing a physical setting in which new versions of the institution can be performed while maintaining visible continuity with the past. The costs of this continuity are real and ongoing. Money must be spent, labor must be performed, compromises must be made. The palace cannot be everything that everyone wants it to be. It cannot be as private as a home, as efficient as an office, as accessible as a museum. It exists in the tensions between these incompatible demands, managing them as best it can, accepting that perfection is impossible and that survival requires perpetual negotiation. What remains, after all the analysis, is a building that continues to function because people continue to believe that it should. The belief is not universal. Critics will always question whether the expenditure is justified, but it is widespread enough and deep enough to sustain the institution through challenges that have destroyed comparable structures elsewhere. The palace stands because enough people want it to stand, and they want it to stand because it represents something that they value: tradition, continuity, national identity, the simple pleasure of beauty created by human hands and preserved across generations. Great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. This is perhaps the most important lesson that Buckingham Palace teaches to those willing to look beyond its facade. The golden ceilings and crimson thrones, the chandeliers and the ceremonial corridors, exist only because generations of workers have labored to maintain them. The symbol persists only because the institution has been willing to adapt its meaning. The magnificence continues only because compromises have been made, access granted, revenue generated, expectations managed. To remain symbolic is not a passive condition. It is an active achievement, renewed constantly through decisions that balance aspiration against reality. The palace endures not as a monument to past glory, but as a living institution that serves present purposes while honoring inherited obligations. Its walls contain not just history, but the ongoing effort to make history relevant, to justify continued investment in structures that logic might suggest should be abandoned. The early morning light strengthens over London. The city awakens around the palace, indifferent to the drama within its walls, but dimly aware that something important happens there, something that connects the present to the past in ways that newer buildings cannot replicate. The palace stands as it has stood for generations, an answer to questions that each era must pose anew. What is the cost of continuity? What is the value of symbols? How do we honor what we have inherited while acknowledging that inheritance is never free? The answers change, the questions persist, and the palace, adapting always, endures. If the survival of a symbol requires constant compromise and hidden labor, does the beauty it represents belong to those who maintain it, or to those who merely admire it from beyond the gates?